Children selected were considered the most perfect, the most beautiful, the most valuable offerings to the gods. They were dressed in fine clothing, given chicha mixed with coca leaves to sedate them, and then walked or carried up mountains to altitudes above 20,000 feet. There, in stone shelters built specifically for this purpose, they were left to die of exposure. The cold and thin air induced hypothermia. Death came slowly. The bodies, naturally mummified by the dry, freezing conditions, have been discovered by modern archaeologists. The girl known as La Doncella, found on Lulayaco volcano in 1999, was approximately 15 years old. Her hair was elaborately braided. Her organs were intact. Analysis of her hair showed elevated levels of coca and alcohol in the months leading up to her death, indicating a long period of preparation and sedation. She was, in the eyes of the empire, a perfect sacrifice. In truth, she was a child killed by the state. Survivor testimonies, recorded by Spanish priests in the decades following the conquest, reveal patterns of trauma, silence, and resignation. Some women who had been Acla spoke of their time in the Acllawasi with a strange mixture of pride and horror, pride because they had been chosen, horror because of what that choosing had cost them. Others refused to speak at all. One account, preserved in the archive of the Diocese of Cusco, describes an older woman who had been an Acla under Huayna Capac. She told the priest that she had learned to become stone, to feel nothing, to want nothing, to exist without memory or hope. She said this was the only way to survive. When asked if she had ever tried to escape, she laughed bitterly and said, "Escape to where? The empire is everywhere." The Spanish conquest in 1532 dismantled the Inca state, but it did not liberate the Acla women. Many were simply transferred from Inca control to Spanish control. Conquistadors took Acla women as concubines and servants. Some were forcibly baptized and married off to Spanish soldiers. Others remained in the Acllawasi, which were reproposed as convents under the supervision of Catholic nuns. The system's structure persisted, only the ideology changed. The language of divine service to the Sapa Inca was replaced with the language of divine service to Christ, but the mechanisms of control, isolation, and exploitation remained fundamentally the same. There is a silence in the historical record that speaks louder than any chronicle. The girls and women who lived and died within the Acllawasi system left behind very few words of their own. We have the accounts of Spanish observers, the records of administrators, the material evidence of archaeological sites. But we have almost no testimony in the voices of the victims themselves. This silence is not accidental. It is structural. The system was designed to erase identity, to replace names with functions, to transform children into categories: weaver, concubine, sacrifice. The empire did not want these girls to speak. It wanted them to serve, to produce, to die quietly when required. Yet traces remain. In the textiles woven by Acla hands, some scholars have identified subtle patterns that deviate from official designs, small rebellions encoded in thread. In the Quipu records, certain knots are irregularly tied, possibly indicating reluctance or resistance by the women who helped maintain these logs. In the frozen bodies of Capacocha victims, forensic analysis reveals stress markers, signs of malnutrition in early childhood followed by improved diet in the months before death, suggesting a life of poverty interrupted by a brief period of ritual fattening before sacrifice. These are not voices, but they are evidence of lives lived under unimaginable pressure. The question we are left with is not whether this system was cruel, that is obvious. The question is how a society constructed and maintained such a system with such efficiency, and how many thousands of girls passed through it without their stories ever being recorded. The Inca Empire lasted, in its mature form, for less than a century. But in that time, it built roads, cities, agricultural terraces, and a bureaucratic apparatus that could administer millions of people across thousands of miles. It also built the Acllawasi network, a machine for extracting and redistributing young women, and it ran that machine with the same precision it applied to everything else. The empire kept records. It assigned officials. It developed protocols. It trained the victims to train the next generation of victims. It made cruelty systematic, and in doing so, made it nearly invisible. How many girls like Quya were there? How many were taken from their villages, trained in silence, married to strangers, or left to die on mountaintops? The numbers are lost, fragmented across unreadable Quipu and incomplete Spanish accounts. But the scale was enormous. The system touched every province. Every family with daughters lived in fear of the Tuquiricac's arrival. Every community paid this tribute in children. And when the empire fell, the stories of those children were buried under new languages, new religions, new forms of exploitation. This is the legacy we inherit, not just the monumental ruins of Machu Picchu or the engineering marvels of Inca roads, but also the memory of a bureaucratic apparatus that turned children into commodities and suffering into ritual. It is uncomfortable history. It does not fit neatly into narratives of noble indigenous civilizations or simple tales of Spanish villainy. It is, instead, a reminder that cruelty does not require monsters. It requires only systems, accepted by enough people, enforced by enough power, and maintained long enough to become normal. If this documentary has made you think, if it has disturbed you or moved you or made you want to learn more, please share it. Subscribe to this channel for more deep investigations into the hidden and uncomfortable corners of history. And leave a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me which historical figure or empire you want me to cover next. Because these stories exist everywhere, in every culture, in every era. They are waiting to be told. And silence, as we have seen, is the tool of those who benefit from forgetting. The cold stone walls of the Acllawasi still stand in Cusco, repurposed and rebuilt over centuries. Tourists walk past them every day, taking photographs, marveling at the precision of Inca masonry. But if you stand quietly in those courtyards, if you let the noise of the modern city fade, you can almost hear the echo of what happened there. The whisper of a girl who was told she was chosen. The silent weeping of a child who would never go home. The rhythm of a loom operated by hands that had no choice but to weave. History is not just what we build. It is also what we do to each other in the shadows of those buildings. And those shadows are long. She learned that the Mamaconas, though stern, were themselves prisoners of the system, and that their cruelty was often born from a desire to prepare the younger girls for worse things to come. She learned that some girls vanished in the night, led away by priests for the capacocha, never seen again. She learned that other girls were dressed in fine clothing and taken to the palace, and that when they returned, if they returned, they did not speak of what had happened. When Quya was 13, the selection was made. She and 7 other girls were pulled from the dormitory and brought to a separate chamber where they were bathed in water infused with herbs and flowers. Their hair was oiled and braided. They were dressed in tunics of the finest vicuna wool, dyed red and gold, fastened with silver pins. They were given small amounts of chicha, fermented maize beer, to drink, not enough to intoxicate, but enough to dull the edge of fear. Then they were told, they had been chosen as gifts. Not for sacrifice, but for marriage. They would be given to provincial governors and generals who had demonstrated loyalty to the Sapa Inca. This was framed as an honor, a bond between the divine ruler and his most trusted servants. The girls were not asked if they consented. Consent was not a concept that applied to them. They were inventory, distributed according to strategic need. Quya was assigned to a general named Yupanqui, a man in his 40s who commanded military forces on the empire's southern frontier. She had never seen him before the wedding ceremony. The ceremony itself took place in a hall within the Coricancha complex. There were priests, nobles, offerings of maize and coca leaves, libations of chicha poured onto the ground. Yupanqui stood in full military regalia, a feathered headdress, a tunic embroidered with geometric patterns, a bronze axe at his side. Quya stood beside him, silent and small. A priest tied their hands together with a woven cord and declared them bound in the sight of Inti. Then Yupanqui led her out of the hall, through the courtyard, and into a private chamber prepared for the night. The chamber was lit with oil lamps. There were textiles on the walls, depictions of the sun and the moon. There was a low platform covered in woven blankets. Yupanqui told her to sit. She did. He poured chicha into 2 wooden cups and handed one to her. She drank because she had learned that obedience kept you safe, or at least safer. He asked her age. She told him. He nodded and said she was fortunate to serve the empire in this way. She said nothing. He spoke about his campaigns, about villages he had conquered, about the honor of serving the Sapa Inca. She nodded when he paused. Then he stood, removed his headdress, and gestured toward the platform. She understood. She lay down. He extinguished most of the lamps, leaving only one flickering in the corner. What happened next was not violent in the way a battle is violent, but it was an exercise of total power over a child who had no choice, no voice, no way to refuse. It was efficient. It was expected. It was, within the logic of the empire, entirely legal and sanctified by religious authority. Afterward, Quya lay still and stared at the ceiling. Yupanqui fell asleep quickly. She listened to his breathing and thought of her mother's face, which she could now barely remember. She thought of the other girls in the Acllawasi, the ones who had been taken for capacocha and buried alive on frozen mountain peaks as offerings to the gods. She thought that perhaps this was the better fate. At least she was alive. At least there was food and shelter. At least she had survived the selection. These were the thoughts the system trained into her: gratitude for not being killed, relief for not being sacrificed, acceptance of rape as marriage, endurance as virtue. In the months that followed, Quya traveled with Yupanqui to his provincial garrison. She lived in a stone house with servants and guards. She was given fine clothing and jewelry. She was, by all external measures, a woman of status. But she was never alone. She was never free to leave. When Yupanqui returned from campaigns, he expected her presence, her service, her silence. When he was gone for weeks at a time, she sat in the courtyard and wove textiles because it was the only skill she had, the only thing that made the hours pass. She bore him a child when she was 15. The birth nearly killed her. The midwives said she was too young, her body not ready, but this was common among the Acllawasi. Many died in childbirth. Many others lived but were left damaged, unable to bear more children, and were then discarded or sent back to the Acllawasi to serve as mamaconas themselves, completing the cycle. Quya survived. Her son was taken to be raised by Yupanqui's principal wife, a woman of noble birth who saw Quya not as a person but as a useful womb. Quya was permitted to see the child occasionally, but she was not his mother in any meaningful sense. She was a vessel the state had provided. When Yupanqui died in battle 3 years later, Quya was sent back to Cusco. She was still only 18. She was installed in the Acllawasi again, this time as a mamacona. Her role now was to train the next generation of girls, to inspect them, to teach them weaving and prayer, to prepare them for the same fate she had endured. She did this work for years. She became efficient, stern, silent. She did not allow herself to remember her village, her mother's voice, the feeling of spinning wool in the sunlight as a child. She could not afford memory. Memory was dangerous. Memory made you weak. But Quya was not unique. The system was vast. Spanish chroniclers, arriving in the 1530s, recorded their shock at the scale of the Acllawasi network. Pedro Cieza de Leon wrote of houses of women held in great seclusion in every major city, with thousands of girls and women sequestered inside. Garcilaso de la Inca, himself of mixed Inca and Spanish heritage, described the rigorous selection process and noted that the most beautiful were reserved for the Sapa Inca, while others were distributed as rewards to those who had served the state. The chronicler Juan de Betanzos reported that during the reign of Huayna Capac, the Sapa Inca maintained personal control over approximately 1,500 Aclla women in Cusco alone, with thousands more in provincial Acllawasi throughout the empire. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations at Acllawasi sites reveal large compounds with restricted access, dormitory-style rooms, weaving tools, cooking areas, and evidence of ritual activity. At some sites, researchers have found remains of young women buried in ceremonial contexts, some showing signs of having been sacrificed, others appearing to have died from childbirth or illness. Quipu records, though fragmentary and still not fully deciphered, include knots that scholars believe correspond to counts of Aclla women, their ages, and their assignments. The Capacocha rituals represent perhaps the most harrowing dimension of this system. These were state-sponsored sacrifices of children, often Aclla girls, performed at high-altitude shrines during times of imperial crisis, droughts, earthquakes, the death of a Sapa Inca, or major military campaigns. The morning air in Cusco is thin and cold. A girl, no older than 10, stands barefoot on polished stone as older women circle her, inspecting her skin, her teeth, her hair. She does not understand why they touch her face with such care, why they whisper measurements to the scribe in the corner. She only knows that yesterday she had a mother, and today she belongs to the Sapa Inca. One woman tilts her chin upward toward the light. Another nods. The scribe makes a mark. The girl will later learn that this mark means Aclla, the chosen one. But right now, in this moment of cold silence, she simply feels the pressure of strange hands deciding her entire future, and she does not yet know that she will never go home again. Before we continue with this story, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this deep dive into hidden history compelling, please hit that like button. It truly helps this content reach others who care about uncovering these untold stories. Subscribe if you want more documentaries like this, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's step back and understand the empire that created this system. The Inca Empire, at its height in the early 1500s, stretched nearly 2,500 miles along the western edge of South America, from modern-day Colombia down through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and into Chile and Argentina. It was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, with an estimated population between 6 and 12 million people. The Sapa Inca, considered a divine son of Inti the sun god, ruled from Cusco with absolute authority. His word was cosmic law. His administrators maintained detailed records using quipu, knotted string systems that logged tributes, population counts, and resource allocation with remarkable precision. Every province owed the empire labor, goods, and loyalty. But there was another tribute, one less discussed in the official chronicles, one that required not crops or gold, but children. Specifically, girls. This was not random violence. This was not the impulsive cruelty of a single tyrant. What the Inca state constructed was a formalized, bureaucratic system for identifying, collecting, isolating, and redistributing young women throughout the empire. It was called the Acllawasi system, the houses of the chosen women, and it operated with the cold efficiency of any other imperial institution. There were officials assigned to inspect children. There were quotas. There were training schedules. There were ceremonies with prescribed rituals. And there were records, kept in quipu knots, tracking how many girls were taken, from which villages, at what age, and for what purpose. The system had a framework. It had oversight. It had, in the eyes of the empire, a sacred logic. Let us focus on one girl. We do not know her birth name, those names were often replaced, but we can reconstruct her experience from archaeological evidence, Spanish chronicles written just after the conquest, and the testimonies of survivors recorded by priests and administrators. Let us call her Quya, a common name meaning queen in Quechua, though she would never be a queen. She was born in a village in the Colca Valley, a region of terraced farms clinging to canyon walls. Her father grew maize and quinoa. Her mother wove textiles. Quya learned to spin wool and help with the harvest. She expected, as all children do, that her life would resemble her mother's. But when she was 8 years old, the Tuquiricuk arrived. This was the title given to imperial inspectors who traveled the provinces, literally meaning he who sees all. These men reported directly to the Sapa Inca and held enormous power. They inspected roads, reviewed quipu records, settled disputes, and selected children for state purposes. On this visit, the Tuquiricuk was accompanied by a Mamikona, an older woman who had herself once been an Aclla and now served as an administrator within the system. They went house to house. They looked at every girl between the ages of 8 and 12. They examined physical features, symmetry of face, clarity of skin, straightness of teeth, length of hair. They asked the village elders about lineage, about whether the family had any deformities, any history of rebellion. Quya's family had none. Her skin was unblemished. Her hair was thick and black. The Mamikona touched her shoulder and spoke a single word to the scribe. The word was suitable. Quya's mother wept, but quietly. To resist was to risk the entire village. The Tuquiricuk explained that this was an honor, that Quya would serve the sun, that she would live in comfort and plenty, that her family's labor tax would be reduced. Her father nodded and said nothing. 3 days later, Quya and 4 other girls from nearby villages were gathered at the local tambo, a way station along the Inca road. They were given new clothing, simple undyed tunics. They were given new sandals. An older Aclla, no more than 16 herself, walked them in single file along the stone highway toward Cusco. It took 12 days. Quya cried the first 3 nights. By the 4th, she had stopped. The other girls were silent too. They learned quickly that questions were not answered, that complaints were ignored, that the system moved forward regardless of what they felt. When they arrived in Cusco, they were taken to an Acllawasi, a walled compound near the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun. The walls were high, built of precisely fitted stone, with no windows facing outward. There was a single entrance, guarded at all times. Inside, the compound was organized like a small city: dormitories, kitchens, weaving rooms, bathing areas, courtyards, and a chapel devoted to Inti. Approximately 200 girls and women lived there, ranging in age from 8 to 25. They were divided by function. Some were being trained as weavers to produce the finest textiles for the Sapa Inca and the gods. Some were being prepared as sacrificial offerings for the Capacocha, ritual killings performed at mountain shrines during times of crisis. Some were destined to become secondary wives or concubines to the Sapa Inca himself or to be given as gifts to loyal nobles and generals. And some, like Quya, were still being evaluated, their ultimate purpose not yet determined. The training was meticulous. Every day began before dawn with a ritual washing in cold water from stone basins. The girls dressed in identical tunics and gathered in rows in the courtyard. A Mamikona led them in hymns to Inti, songs in Quechua that praised the sun's light and the Sapa Inca's divinity. Breakfast was a thin porridge of quinoa. Then the day's labor, weaving, spinning, cooking, learning prayers, memorizing the genealogies of the royal family. The Mamaconas moved among them, watching, correcting. Mistakes in weaving were punished with reduced meals. Talking during prayer was punished with hours spent kneeling on stone. Any mention of home, any weeping, any resistance, was met with isolation, days alone in a small chamber with no light and little food. Quya learned to weave. Her fingers became fast and precise. She learned to dye wool with cochineal and indigo. She learned the prayers. She learned to keep her face blank, her voice soft, her body still.